In this tutorial, we're going to go over how to use the Guest Registry application. First, I'm going to go to the admin page because I'm logged in as the administrator and click on Guest Registry. This immediately brings up the Guest Registry options, the administrator options for the application. The instructions field is common. You've seen this in other applications where you can enter some text that will appear at the top of the page when someone is using the application. The search only field is a group of member groups that you would set up in Group Manager. So these are all the groups that we have in Group Manager. And you can see I've set up in Group Manager prior to this a group called Front Gate. That could be your check-in desk, just depends on your community type. Guard House, Guard Gate. And this is not a restriction like you'd see with the Restrict To fields. This is actually going to say that members of this group are going to use the application differently. When they log into the application, they will go directly to a lookup page. Because theoretically, if you're at the front desk and someone says, I want to go visit my friend at this address or this unit number, the first thing you want to do is look up that member to see to see if they have the proper address and to see if this person is on their guest list. So this group is restricted in that they can only do lookups on different members' guest lists and see the guest lists and admit members or admit guests to the community or to the building. These two fields are both related to that lookup, that search function. These are used to determine whether a lookup on the address field or the apartment field, because the person who's doing this front check-in desk or front guard gate house, they can look up a member by their last name, their address, or their apartment unit in order to see who the valid guests are for this person. So this field allows you to choose which ones are used for the search. So in some communities, let's say where there are seasonal residents, the residents may have set up their profiles with their alternate address being off-site and their primary address being their on-site address when they are at the community, in which case you'd want to search the primary address or primary unit. But perhaps it's the reverse, in which case you might want to select look up by the alternate address. Or you can have it set to both, in which case it'll find any member that has the address that was searched in either field. But by default, it will default to the alternate address. This option show guest notes when mouse hovers over name or company. When a member's guest list is shown, there'll be one line per guest that they have registered. Every guest can have special notes associated with their name. This just determines whether you want those notes to appear when the mouse is hovered over that guest's record. The show expired and future registration on guest listing page by default setting. That means when someone goes to look up, the front gate goes to look up a member's guest list, and they see that guest list on the page. That guest list may include guests who are either future registrations or expired registrations, because each guest can either be permanent or temporary. If they're permanent, they'll always show up on the member's guest list when somebody's looking them up. If they are temporary, they may not show up, because if they are temporary for the future, for example, I have an appointment, I have someone coming to the house on Friday, and today's Wednesday. Well, in that case, when someone looks up that member's guest list and views the guest list on the screen, they don't want to see the list of guests who are only valid for this coming Friday. So the list will by default only show guests who are active today, who have a date range that includes today. And that just keeps the list short for that front gate or that check-in desk. So they're not looking at a list of 100 guests. They may only see 5 or 6 that are actually valid for today, and they can admit them or not. If you check this box, it will show those other registrations, those other guests, regardless of when their date range is valid or not. So this is the administrative options page. Let's get into the actual app. I've added it to the members submenu here, which it's not by default, but you can do that through the menu editor. And if you're not familiar with menu editor, you can use the tutorial we have for the menu editor to get familiar with how to add a new item to the menu. So here we go into the guest registry. This is what I see as an administrator. I see my list of guests because as an administrator, I might still be a resident and want to have my own list of guests. But I have a few extra features. One is the options, which is the page we just did. There's also the search function. As an administrator, I can look up other members' guest lists in order to manage them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but as an administrator, you may need to remove a guest from a list if there's been a problem with that guest. But I will also say that as an administrator, you cannot add guests to another member's list or modify their guests. You can only delete them. And the reason we don't allow them to add guests is really out of a safety privacy issue. We don't want an administrator to be able to say, hey, I've got this person I want to let into the community, but I don't want to let them in under my own guest list. I'm going to let them in under somebody else's guest list. And I'll add them to that other person's guest list. And now when they show up, they'll be able to get in, even though that person never added them. So, I mean, this would, of course, presuppose you have an administrator, a website administrator with, nefarious reasons for wanting to usurp security in the community. But that is the reason that we don't want to allow administrators to be able to add guests for other people. It's kind of the same thing as not allowing administrators to opt other members in for email, because those members may say, I don't want to receive email. And so we don't allow the administrator to override that. Okay, so this is the page you would see as a normal user coming in. In fact, I'm going to log in as a standard non-administrative user so you can see what a guest list looks like. So let me log out. And I'm going to log in as the demo user. Now I'm logged in. I'm going to go to my guest registry. And here you can see it's a little simpler interface. We don't have the options or the search button. I just have the option as a regular user to add a guest or to create and modify a guest list, which I'll go over in a second. So by default, there are really two lists. There's permanent guests, which are guests that you are always going to want to allow into the community. This could be, relatives, family, or other friends that you just know are going to be back on a repeated basis. You never really know when, but you want them to be able to get in whenever they want and come visit you. So you can add permanent guests. And then there's a table of temporary guests. Now, this is for guests that you want to allow into the community to come to your house or to your apartment only for a specific date range. So you can see the ones that are showing up here. I've added a few with today's date. And for example, you might have a repair person coming to your house, and you can see I've added this one. Let me go into the edit page. And this is the same form you would see if you were adding a new one. It would just say add guest information. And up top is just your own information. And on the form, we've got the first name, last name, company, email address, whether or not they're permanent. If you check the permanent box, you don't have a starting and ending date. If you uncheck that box, you must fill in the starting and ending date. And here's a field for some notes. You can enter notes if you want about this guest. I don't have a good reason offhand, but we put the field in there just in case your community has a need for it. And these are the notes I talked about during the options, where they'll hover. If you hover over top of a guest in a list, it will appear for the person doing the lookup and viewing your guest list. You have the option to delete the guest down here in the delete link, just like most of our other applications put the delete link down in this corner of the form. So this is where you would enter your guest. In this case, I've entered a repair company because they're only going to show up for one day to do a repair, hopefully. And this is the date they're going to come. So I want them to be allowed during this date range, but not allowed on a different date. So let me go back to the registry here. Okay, so now we've got the list of guests. We have temporary and permanent guests. Let's look at guest lists. What are guest lists? Well, a guest list is when you are going to have an event, let's say. And if I go into here, I can manage my lists, and you can see I've got two lists. I've got a birthday party and a meeting. And so I can create a list of guests that are only for that one event. So I've created a birthday party. And, well, let me show you how to add a new list. First, we're going to create a list, because you have to create a list before you can add members to it. So if I click add, it asks for the list name. You should enter an alphanumeric name here. Keep it simple. Avoid strange symbols and other punctuation. So let's just call this another party, since I already have one called party. And I click add. And now it goes right into the edit page for me to start adding guests. So I'm editing the another party guest list. Now this is a little different than adding individual guests. And so the reason we have this is these guests are all going to share the same starting and ending date. And rather than have you click on add guest, go in, fill in a starting date and ending date, first, last name, company, email, and then save, go back to the list, click add again, enter the starting and ending date, which you might get wrong if you typo, and so it might not match the other guest. This simplifies that. This says I have a starting and ending date, which I'm going to just happen to put in. Let's put it in for Friday. I'm going to put in Friday's date because that's when this party is going to be. And now I can just start adding members. So I can put in and I can put an email address in or not. It's optional. The reason you might want to put email addresses in for your members or for your guests is if you intend to email them later about this event. You want to send an email out and say, hey, it's been postponed or something. You have that option later if they have email addresses. There's an option down here. You can see this link, email guest list, which lets you send a brief message to the people on a specific list. Or the list you're looking at this time. So you may want to enter email addresses for your guests. If you don't see yourself using that feature, it's not required. So when you're done, you click on add. And now it comes back to the list. That person's been added. It keeps the same starting and ending date. And now I can add another guest. Let's do and again I'll click add. It adds her to the list, and now I'm back again. I can add more people and do this as long as I want. Now another option you have is if you come into this list and you say, oh, I spelled her name wrong, you can go click in here and make the modification. Then you can just click save. You don't need to click add because it's not a new member. That's only for this row down here. You can just click save and it'll save any changes you've made to the list. You can also click delete and it will delete the row that you've selected from the list. So now that we're done with this list, let's go back to the registry. And now we can see on the temporary guest list, we can see Jill Harper's been added and Tom Wensley's been added down here. Now you can see there's a different status icon here. When I hover over it, it says outside active date range. And that's because that guest's date range is outside the active date. Right now, our date is 9/15 today. And so they are outside the active date range. So they will not be shown on the list of guests for this member if the gatehouse or the front desk check-in goes to look them up. So let's go take a look at that now. Let's actually log in as the front desk or the guardhouse, and we'll see how this all looks. So this is what it looks like when you are a regular member managing your list. You have your permanent guests and your temporary guests. You can edit them by using the edit icon or delete them. The status, the active status, let me just show you real quick what that is. If I edit this member, you'll see this active box up here. It has nothing to do with their permanent or checkbox or date range, whether they're in range or not for the current date. This is just, you can make a guest inactive and leave them on your registry. So maybe later you want to make them active again. So maybe you have a permanent guest that for a short period of time you want to make it so they can't get in, and then you put them back on the list again. And then you can just check that box without having to delete them and re-enter them. That's all that box is for. Most times it will not be used that commonly, but that is what that checkbox is for. You don't want to delete them. You want to take them off your active list so that they can't be admitted, and you can put them back later. So let me go back to the guest registry. And then, of course, you can delete members by clicking the X next to the members row. Okay, and just to show you, if I were to edit this person who is not active today, they are not within the active range today. If I edit them, they do have an active checkbox. So again, this has nothing to do with this date range. It's just whether it's kind of an override. They're either not active or they're active. If they're not active, it doesn't matter what date they have. If they're active, then it looks to the date range or if they're permanent. All right, let's return to the list. And let me go back and log out, and I'll log in as the front desk or gate. I think we called them the gate user in here. So this is what the person who is the front desk check-in person would see. If you remember back in the setup info page, or the setup page for this app, there was that field, the search only field, and we selected the front gate group. And now I, as a member of that group in this, with my gate profile that I'm logged in under right now, that's a member of that front gate group that was selected there. So all I can do is search. So if you noticed, when I selected guest registry from here, I don't go in and see a guest registry. I don't see my own list of guests because I don't theoretically have one. I am simply the guard at the gatehouse or at the check-in desk. So I go directly to the lookup page because that's what they would do most frequently. They would start the app and say, oh, there's a person here who wants to come in and visit their friend or their family. Let me look them up. So what they would do is they would look them up by the last name, let's say, and I'm going to look up the demo user person, whose last name is user, and this list appears. Now, if there was more than one person in the community or in the building with the last name user, they would show up here. We'd have a list of multiple people, and I could verify which one they were talking about, either by the first name or by the address. And then I click on guests to view that person's guests, and now I can determine whether or not the person who's coming to the front desk or to the guardhouse is on the list of active guests. And you can see that those members that I had before that did not have an active date. They had an active date of 9, or a valid date of 9/16. They're not listed because today is not the 16th. So it keeps the list short by not showing them by default. Again, I could check this box, show expired and future registrations, and now we can see those 2 people who are going to be valid tomorrow. They'll show up now, even though they're not really valid for today. They'll show up, but by default, this will be unchecked. And that keeps the list shorter. So the person doing the check-in at the front desk or at the guardhouse doesn't see a long list of a bunch of old or future registrations that aren't really applicable. All I want to know is who is allowed in today. So this shows them, and now I can say, okay, well, Bill Thompson is here. I'm going to go ahead and admit him because he's valid. He's on the list. He's been admitted. And now I can return to the guest lookup page and look for another member to let in the next person in line. So that's what we see as the gate guardhouse check-in person. But now let me log in as the admin again, because I want to show you what that admission did when I clicked admit. It added them to a log. And so what that lets us do is that lets us, as the admin, I'm going to do a search. I'm going to go into demo user again. Search for that member. Now I'm going to view their guests. Now I am the admin looking at a different member's guests, but I can go down here and I can say view guest history. So when I click on that link, it shows a list of guest history for this member. It shows me which member I'm looking at. And let's say I want to show only the history for a specific member that I know I'm looking for. I want to see just how many times Bill Thompson has come in. I can click on that and it will filter the list and show me just Bill Thompson. It'll also show companies like Acme Repair. I want to see how many times this member has had Acme Repair come in and on what dates, because maybe something happened in the community on a certain date and there's a suspicion about a certain person or a company that did it, and we want to look up to see what their history is. Now again, this will only show the history for Acme Repair if I select that, or Bill Thompson. It will only show that history if they were admitted when they were coming to visit demo user. If Acme Repair came to see a different member, they will not be shown on this list. You'd have to look up another member to see their guest list. But in this case, if I want to see a particular person who was a guest of a particular member, I can view their history, and I can see here that on 9/15 at 5:45 p.m., Bill Thompson was admitted. And this shows which person admitted them, which profile was logged in when they clicked the admit button. And the reason we have that is, you could theoretically have one profile on your system for gate guard or check-in desk, and all the people who work at the gate or all people who work at the check-in desk could log in under that same profile. But I'd recommend against that, and the reason is, if you want to be able to go back and find out who admitted this person, and for a very particular reason, you want to know who was working the desk that day, you may want to be able to differentiate between which person working that day admitted them. In that case, having separate profiles that all belong to that front gate group that I created, and that group can be called anything, check-in desk or whatever, but they all belong to that group, but they're individual profiles. So each person logging in as the front desk would only be doing it under their own profile. And so when a person's admitted, it would show that person's name here, the specific person who admitted that guest. So that's why you may want to do that. And so that's how you look at the person's history or the guest's history for a particular member, or you may want to look at just all the history for that member. And again, this is an administrative only function. Well, actually, the member themselves can look at their own guest history list if they have a reason to see when somebody came to visit them. But this is more an administrative feature. So that is the two parts of this app. The normal member part, which is as a normal member, I log in, I add members, I create lists, and I can manage that list or delete members from the list and change their valid dates. I can have permanent members and temporary members who have a date range. And then we have the other side of the app, which is the front desk guard gatehouse part. And when they log in, they go right to the search screen and they can search for members and see that member's guest list, which would look more like this. As an administrator, I can delete, but I cannot add. The front desk clerk will not even have this option. They can only view that list. If you remember when we saw that list, they don't have any option to modify any member's guest list. So I hope you find this new application helpful in your community, and I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thank you very much for watching.